Thank you. So this was published as part of a symposium on dissent that just came out recently, but actually it was organized 2 years ago, long before we knew that Donald Trump was going to be president. Just fortuitous that it was like so perfectly timely to come out in the current political situation. I have only a few slides. I'm not doing the usual PowerPoint. So mostly I'm going to read from the manuscript. So it may be conventional to think of dissent in terms of the lone individual who, in Thoreau's famous words, does not keep pace with his companions because he hears a different drummer. But dissent is a social act. It is defined by its engagement with the audience whom it confronts and hopes to convert. It is social too in the sense that it comes freighted with a cultural and historical logic. Dissent has an iconography, a mythology, and a liturgy. By iconography, I mean a conventional set of images or symbols that exemplify the idea of dissent. All right, there we go. That's the first one. There we go. Dr. King in front of the Lincoln Memorial, flanked by two men in white cotton caps who served as security the day of the march. That's too fast. There we go. Eugene Debs, gesticulating at a Milwaukee rally, the corners of his open suit jacket spread wide by the wind. Too fast again. Sorry. There we go. And Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates, the subject's index finger extended, much like Debs's is, as he reaches with his other hand for the cup of hemlock. This iconography includes as well stories which offer striking images that crystallize values. Abraham smashing the idols in his father's shop, Jesus driving the money changers from the temple. These tales serve as paradigms of dissent for those whom they inspire. By mythology, I mean narratives or allegories that affirm a reassuring popular belief. Let her and falsehood grapple, Milton averred, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. The tropes of truth struggling to get free and the vindication of those who advocate for truth both have biblical roots. The midrash of Abraham, smashing the idols, continues with his father bringing him before the king, who throws Abraham in a fiery furnace. Abraham is miraculously saved, just as elsewhere in the Hebrew literature, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego are spared when thrown into the furnace by the Nebuchadnezzar, and Daniel is saved when he is thrown in the lion's den. It takes courage to speak truth to power, but in these, as in many other religious tales, divine intervention assures that the righteous win out. Justices Holmes and Brandeis play this mythological role in the American constitutional tradition. Celebrated as the great dissenters for their opposition to the old court's conservatism, Holmes and Brandeis were viewed by many as prophets. Herbert Wetzler told my constitutional law class that when he was a law student in the late 1920s, he and his classmates treated the latest Holmes and Brandeis dissents as virtually sacred texts to be read and studied. Cardozo compared judicial dissenters to, quote, prophets and martyrs whose eyes are fixed on the eternities, close quote. And in time, many of Holmes's and Brandeis's most famous dissents did have their day. Their deference to the economic and social policy decisions of democratically elected legislatures and their solicitude for the rights of free speech and privacy would become the law of the land in time. By liturgy, I mean solemn, even ritualized texts of remembrance, solace, and defiance. Some are actual liturgy, such as the Eileh Ezkara, which translates as These I Will Remember, recited as part of the Musaf service on Yom Kippur, which recounts the martyrdom at the hands of the Romans of 10 of the great rabbis of the Mishnah. Others are folk songs, such as Alfred Hayes and Earl Robinson's 1938 song Joe Hill, first made famous by Paul Robeson, but perhaps best known from Joan Baez's performance of it at Woodstock. The song affirms that Joe Hill, an Industrial Workers of the World, or Wobbly organizer, who was executed by the state of Utah in 1915, that he lives on wherever workers organize, and the refrain from the song says, Joe, I didn't die, and smiling with his eyes, says Joe, what they can never kill went on to organize. A particularly poignant subgenre consists of the allocutions before sentencing of celebrated political defendants. When Debs was convicted under the Espionage Act in 1918, he famously declared, while there is a lower class, I am in it, and while there is a criminal element, I am of it, and while there is a soul in prison, I am not free. Addressing the apartheid court that convicted him of sabotage in 1964, Nelson Mandela began with a recitation of the narratives of resistance with which he grew up, and I'm not going to read the passage, but I put it up there on the slide for you, and his hope of living up to them as role models. In Nomos, a Narrative, Robert Cover speaks of what he calls the texts of resistance, upon which a dissenting community calls when it faces the violence of the state. There is a strong affinity between what Cover identifies as texts of resistance and what I here identify as the Liturgy of Dissent, but the two are not synonymous. For Cover, texts of resistance comprise the interpretive process by which a dissenting community comes to understand, quote, what is right and just in the violent context that the group will encounter, and limits the situations in which resistance is a legitimate response, close quote. Texts of resistance are a form of non-state law. The Declaration of Independence is such a text because it was crafted, quote, carefully to recount the reasons that led to the decision to resist and to justify that resistance before a common humanity, close quote. Lillian Hellman's celebrated letter to the House Un-American Activities Committee is another example. After pronouncing the rules governing the invocation of the Fifth Amendment privilege, quote, very difficult for a layman to understand, and here's a portion of the text here, she explains her understanding of the standards governing her behavior. I won't read the full passage. She says in the middle of the first paragraph, I do not like subversion or disloyalty in any form, but to hurt innocent people whom I knew many years ago in order to save myself is to me inhuman and indecent and dishonorable. I cannot and will not cut my conscience to fit this year's fashions. Hellman then goes on to invite the HUAC to abide by this, which she identifies as a simpler standard. It is my belief that you will agree with these simple rules of human decency and will not expect me to violate the good American tradition from which they spring. I would therefore like to come before you without waive her own privilege against self-incrimination and speak only of myself. In the face of official law she finds reprehensible, Hellman asserts an alternative law that defies, in her case successfully, HUAC's inquisitorial tactics. The Liturgy of Dissent, in contrast, proposes community rather than law. It consists of texts like the stories of Mandela's childhood that memorialize past contributions, fortify group identity, and inspire future sacrifice. Thus, Mandela concluded his allocution with the affirmation that I have cherished the ideal of a democratic and free society in which all persons live together in harmony and with equal opportunities. It is an ideal which I hope to live for and to achieve, but if needs be, it is an ideal for which I am prepared to die. Protest songs, particularly the civil rights and anti-war movements of the 1960s and 70s, provide an especially rich source of texts that build community in this way. We Shall Overcome, Fannie Lou Hamer's stunning rendition of Go Tell It on the Mountain, Sam Cooke's A Change Is Going to Come, Neil Young's Ohio, and Stephen Still's Find the Cost of Freedom, and whose refrain runs, find the cost of freedom buried in the ground, Mother Earth will swallow you, lay your body down, are impassioned examples. Commitment and community, empathy and identity, solidarity and sacrifice are the central themes of this subgenre. Despite this difference, the text of resistance constituting law, the Liturgy of Dissent constituting community, the similarities between the two genres are robust. Both promote unity and aspire to motivate action. Both are normative. The texts of resistance expound the norms by which the community may, quote, live a law that is self-conscious and lawful by its own lights, close quote. The Liturgy of Dissent does so by affirming the community's understanding of the values worth fighting and dying for. And both genres share an unflinching appreciation of the stakes, quote, just as living in the economic world entails an understanding of price, so living in the normative world entails an understanding of the measures of commitment to norms in the face of contrary commitment of others. That quotes from Robert Cover. Thoughtful dissenters understand that their actions will be unpopular and will subject them to opprobrium, ostracism, or worse. Oops. Back to Socrates. The fact is, Socrates asserts at his trial, that no man in the world will come off safe who honestly opposes either you or any other multitude and tries to hinder the many unjust and illegal doings in a state. Holmes saw such persecution as the perfectly logical expression of a Nietzschean will to power. Quote, if you have no doubt of your premises or your power and want a certain result with all your heart, you naturally express your wishes in law and sweep away all opposition. But its social logic seems more persuasive from the opposite perspective. As Socrates well understood, the gadfly makes the horse uncomfortable, and the most natural response is to swat it as forcefully as possible. But the text of resistance and the Liturgy of Dissent take strikingly different attitudes toward these costs. For the former, the interpretive act of resistance includes, quote, an awareness of the risk of pain and death. The signers of the Declaration of Independence pledged their lives, their fortunes, and their sacred honor because they knew that the punishments for treason against the crown were execution, forfeiture, and corruption of the blood. Different communities developed distinctive adaptations to the prospect of violence. Quote, religious communities have a special jurisprudence of exile and martyrdom. Revolutionary cadres evolve special principles governing life in prison or on the barricades. For the most part, Robert Cover says, these efforts, quote, to interpret the text of resistance have a strange, almost doomed character. The Liturgy of Dissent, in contrast, is notable for its transvaluation of suffering into normative triumph and even joy. In Violence and the Word, Robert Cover discusses the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva in the Eila Ezkara, to which I referred earlier, as an extreme example of the violence on which legal meaning always rests. But what is most striking about this example is the way in which Rabbi Akiva transformed the meaning of that violence. As recounted in the Talmud, it was the time of the morning Shema reading when Rabbi Akiva was taken out to be murdered publicly. During his frightful ordeal, he accepted God's sovereignty upon himself by reciting the Shema joyously and oblivious to the pain. Turnus Rufus, the Roman commander who ordered the barbarous executions, was flabbergasted. Have you no feeling of pain that you can laugh in the face of such intense suffering? He exclaimed. Even Rabbi Akiva's own students wondered, our teacher, even to this extent? The dying sage explained, all my life I was concerned over a phrase of the Torah. We are taught in the Shema to accept God's sovereignty and decrees upon ourselves, b'chol nafshecha, with all of your soul. This implies one must serve God even if it means forfeiting one's life. I used to wonder if I would ever have the privilege of serving God to such a degree. Now that the chance has come to me, shall I not grasp it with joy? The same sensibilities of the value of sacrifice on one hand, and of joy and triumph on the other, are evident in Find the Cross of Freedom and Joe Hill, respectively. The cost of dissent looms large in the Hebrew prophets, with Jeremiah and Jonah serving as bookends on either end of the issue. Jeremiah is the most persecuted of the prophets and the most outspoken in his complaints about his role. Because of his prophecy of defeat, destruction, and exile, there are plots against his life. He is beaten and put in the stocks. The princes accuse him of discouraging the troops and cast him into a pit to die. Jeremiah reproaches God for his troubles. He complains of being isolated and in pain. He remonstrates with God for making him a laughingstock and the target of such murderous plots. He laments that he was ever born. Jonah, on the other hand, is the most stubborn and contumacious of the prophets. He refuses God's command to preach to the Assyrians. He tries to flee, booking passage on a ship to the furthest end of known civilization, Spain's Atlantic coast. The ship is beset by a storm. Rather than let his shipmates perish, Jonah tells them to throw him overboard. He is swallowed by a great fish, from whose belly he repents. He fulfills his mission. The Assyrians atone and are saved. But Jonah is unhappy with this outcome. He is angry with God and argues with him. He asks to die. God provides him with a shade tree, but then destroys it. Jonah again asks to die. God admonishes Jonah that if he has such pity for a tree which he did not grow, he should understand when God has mercy on his own creations. For the faithful, Jonah is a book about the duty to accept one's calling and an affirmation of God's compassion for all his creatures. But, even within the tradition, the question of Jonah's motive is perplexing. The rabbis proffer various principled explanations for his behavior, suggesting, for example, that Jonah knew the Assyrians would repent and feared that it would reflect badly on the Israelites, or that Jonah foresaw that the Assyrians would later, in Isaiah's time, attack the kingdom of Israel. But within the traditional framework, the difficult issue is not the question of motive, but the problem of rationality. What was Jonah thinking? How does one refuse the omnipotent? How does one flee the omnipresent? The problem of Jonah's reasoning is yet more glaring for modern readers who expect psychological verisimilitude from the characters they encounter in literature. Jonah's refusal and flight might make sense if he feared that, like Jeremiah, he would be persecuted and reviled. But at the end of the book, Jonah makes clear that his concern from the start was that his mission would be successful. That is, that the Assyrians would heed his warnings and that God would be merciful and forgive them. So what was Jonah thinking? The answer is that Jonah is a patriot whose overriding commitment lies with his people. We know this from three details of the story. First, arguing with God after their deliverance, Jonah pointedly proclaims that he knew, ad hayosi alad nasi, when I was still on my own soil, that God would forgive the Assyrians. His point of view is, in an almost literal sense, determinedly nationalistic. This identification with and allegiance to his people outweighs his loyalty to God. When God commands him on a mission he can neither abide nor effectively contest, he runs to the ends of the known world. In other words, having neither loyalty nor voice, Jonah chooses exit. Not because he thinks he can hide from the all-seeing, as we shall see in a moment, he knows he cannot. Rather, he chooses not to participate because he cannot bear to break faith with his community. Second, Jonah behaves oddly when the storm hits the ship. The sailors are all frightened and cry out to their gods. Jonah, in contrast, reacts with equanimity. He descends into the hold of the ship, lies down, and goes to sleep. The ship's captain indignantly wakes him up and asks why he is not praying to his God. When the sailors cast lots to determine the cause of the tempest, and Jonah is identified as the culprit, he tells them to spare themselves by casting him into the sea. The sailors refuse, not wanting his blood on their hands, and they try futilely to row to shore. Only when this fails do they relent and cast Jonah overboard. The chapter ends with the sailors' conversion experience. Throughout the entire episode, though, Jonah remains calm and essentially silent. There is no point during the storm at which Jonah fears for his life or prays for deliverance. He is not trying to escape his fate. Indeed, he seems unperturbed by God's furious reaction, as if he expected and accepted it from the start. Third, after prophesying to the Assyrians, Jonah does not return home. Rather, he goes to the eastern edge of the city, reversing the aborted trip west to Spain, and lives in a flimsy thatched roof hut, a sukkah, or booth, like those the Jews lived in during the Exodus from Egypt. This is the seventh day of the holiday of Sukkot, which celebrates that. There, in his sukkah on the eastern edge of the city, he waits to see whether the Assyrians' deliverance will be undone and the suspended judgment imposed. When it is not, Jonah remonstrates with God anew, which is why God must teach him yet another hard-headed lesson. Jonah is angry because he cannot affect his situation, he has no voice, nor resign himself to it, loyalty. He is left only with a symbolic affirmation of identification with his community, one that underscores his status as an exile. Where Jeremiah is a gadfly and lone critic of temporal authority, Jonah is a lone dissenter from celestial authority. Jeremiah has voice. When he complains of his mistreatment, God responds that he will protect and save him. When Jeremiah is thrown in the pit, he is rescued. For Jonah, in contrast, all exits are blocked. What little comfort he has, the shade tree, is destroyed. If Jeremiah is the most querulous of prophets, Jonah is the hardiest. Like Melville and Dostoevsky in the 19th century, and Leonard Cohen in our own time, this is a footnote, Jonah has the courage to quarrel with God. It is tempting for many, even admirers, to read Jonah as insolent or impudent. But Jonah is, I think, a modest man. He chooses to live on the fringes of society, Spain, the edge of the Assyrian city. He lives in a simple hut under primitive conditions. And he's a brave man. He runs from the inescapable with full knowledge of the impotence of his act. He is preternaturally calm on board during the storm because, like all thoughtful dissenters, he understands that there is a price to pay for opposition and defiance. He is selfless. He is a patriot. Not only does he risk God's wrath to protect his people, but, like Lillian Hellman, he is not willing to let innocence suffer on his account. If Jeremiah is a study in voice and Jonah a cautionary tale of exit, Socrates in Crito provides an etude on the theme of loyalty. When your country is angry, he says, quote, you must either persuade her or do what she commands. Socrates understands, of course, that his is not really a binary choice, for he was a winning player in his legal melodrama. He reminds Crichton that it was open to him at trial to propose an alternative punishment. Instead, he rejected imprisonment and banishment and suggested a modest fine that he knew would be unacceptable, even offensive to his Athenian jury. In his final words, he acknowledges to Crichton that he, quote, chose death before banishment. For as he argues in the Apology, it would be strange indeed if, quote, where God posted me with the duty to be a philosopher and to test myself and others, there I should fear either death or anything else and desert my post. Some men, Thoreau says, serve the state with their bodies. Quote, they are the standing army and the militia, jailers, constables, posse comitas, etc. Others serve the state with their heads, quote, as most legislators, politicians, lawyers, ministers, and office holders. They, he says, quote, are as likely to serve the devil without intending to as God, close quote. Only a handful serve the state with their consciences. They are, quote, the heroes, patriots, martyrs, reformers in the great sense, and men, because they necessarily resist it for the most part and are commonly treated as enemies. Like Socrates, Thoreau understands that dissent comes with a heavy price. The true dissenter proves his bona fides in accepting the cost with uncommon grace.
Oh. But Steve has generously left a lot of time.
A lot of time.
For you to interrogate.
Yes, go ahead.
I just noticed that most of I was paying attention, but I don't quite know what you were talking about, but I was paying attention. And most of them were like sacrificing their own selves for the purpose of God or whatnot.
Or some greater good.
Yeah, some greater good. But they were all men. Is that just by selection, or is that work on purpose? I don't know. There are no martyrs or high figures that are women?
No, there certainly are many martyrs. But actually,
Or is it not as brutal of a sacrifice?
it's a fair question, and I'm not sure I have a satisfactory answer for it. But I was just on the martyr point. I'm actually less interested in martyrdom per se, actually. So I don't actually see all martyrs and dissenters as necessarily the same. And so the whole Christian theology of martyrdom is actually largely absent from this paper, and that part is by conscious choice.
Okay.
The lack of women, like I said, I take it as a fair question. I'm really interested in the canon and the tradition. And the canon and the tradition is, of course, patriarchal. That's not an accident. So it reflects that. One could fairly criticize morally the canon for that, and I think rightly so. But I'm interested in the sort of the historical, cultural phenomenon that we have a tradition of dissent, right, and a tradition that teaches people how to handle dissent and the cost of it. That tradition happens also to be sexist, is like all our other traditions, right? I think that's right. Yeah, and of course, I suppose to take on your criticism, it would make sense to, the paper's already published, but it would make sense maybe to include something on the suffragettes in the early part of the 20th century. That would be a great example of women, particularly the many women who were jailed and force-fed.
Yeah,
actually fairly brutal.
My interest.
Yeah. So yeah, no, I think it's a fair point. I accept the criticism.
I appreciate it.
Yeah.
Is your argument that the moral person knows how to take punishment well?
Yeah, I think that's a fair statement. I think that's a fair statement. I think that's what I find striking about so many of these figures. Right. And not to diminish in any way the sacrifices of the suffragettes. I don't know that there's a suffragette figure or a feminist icon. Many of whom I think are genuinely heroines who actually have face the same thing in the same way that, say, Mandela did or Dr. King did, or right. So that's partial defense. Gloria Steinman, great person, had tremendous positive impact, but she didn't face the same kinds of discrimination, harassment, her life being threatened. Dr. King's house was bombed twice. And, that was, of course, common occurrence for civil rights workers in the South. That's not an unusual thing. So it's not exactly on all fours, and maybe that's also part of the reason. But I do think that that's what's really striking to me is that grace, and that's why I end on that note, the note of grace. It's not just that they're willing to sacrifice themselves. There are many, many more people in the course of history, known, famous, and not famous, who've been willing to sacrifice themselves. But it's the transvaluation of suffering into joy and grace that is what interests me about their behavior, but also about this literature, right? This liturgy, which is designed to encode that and communicate that and teach that. That's a yes. Yes.
In the way of dissenters, through time, which one had the most influence in pushing the state towards a more liberal policy making?
Probably Dr. King, but certainly in my lifetime, Dr. King. Debs, I think, is a very powerful icon and very committed and brave person, but I don't know they had quite the same effect in actually changing society. He had an effect on many people on the left in subsequent generations, but I don't know that he had as direct an effect. And of course, ultimately, Mandela, his role in the end of apartheid, obviously had a tremendous effect. Although, largely as symbol and inspiration, since he spent a big chunk of his life locked up on Robbins Island, not able directly to work in the movement, but certainly inspiration too. And if you've read any of accounts of people who met Mandela, particularly accounts by his jailers, right, who met him when he was in Robbins Island, the thing that they don't necessarily use the word grace, but the thing that they always note about him is his dignity, his grace. That's what I think is really striking. And that requires tremendous self-knowledge and I think tremendous self-discipline. And in all the different senses of the term self-discipline too. It's the capacity sort of to transcend one's situation and have that change affect how you interact with the world, your whole attitude, your whole disposition towards the world. That's what I think is sort of the key lesson, and that's what I think distinguishes historically these figures, including Socrates. Going back to Socrates' introduction, I'm not a big Socrates fan, or Plato, but this part of Socrates, he lays down a template for dealing with dissent. That I think the great dissent, the truly great dissenter. Not the judges. They pay no price at all, right? So am I talking about them as the great? They are in fact referred to as the great dissenters. But I refer to them not because I think they should be included in this group, precisely because I think they don't belong in this group. Right? As a contrasting case, because they risk nothing. They have jobs for life, right? And acolytes, right? They're there to be a contrasting case. That section is intended with some degree of irony.
I wonder a little about the overshooting of the target that
Okay.
that there may be, particularly if the notion is that the only true patriot is the dissenter. That
I don't think I'd go that far.
it sounded like you were at the very end getting to that.
Well, Thoreau may go
Yeah.
that far.
Yeah.
Thoreau might. I think that. Yeah, Thoreau may be saying.
Yeah.
But that's not my actual.
There's at some point, potential for a celebration of hubris that might actually be destructive if people are so convinced that they hear the voice of God.
Sure. No, absolutely. Which was one reason why I wouldn't include Joan of Arc. For just that reason. Not that she wasn't a great patriot and a martyr, but she certainly had the hubris, right? So the key passage here is, I'm going to go back, I'll read it out loud again, and then I'll tell you the secret of this piece. I say it's tempting for many, even admirers, to read Jonah as insolent or impudent, but Jonah, I think, is a modest man. He chooses to live on the fringes of society, And he is a brave man. He runs from the inescapable with full knowledge of the impotence of his act. He is preternaturally calm on board during the storm because, like all thoughtful dissenters, he understands there is a price to pay for opposition and defiance. He is selfless. He is a patriot. Not only does he risk God's wrath to protect his people, but like Lillian Hellman, he's not willing to let innocents suffer on his account. Every one of those sentences has a footnote, and every one of those footnotes is about Edward Snowden. And that's what this paper is actually about. Right. So, and I think he precisely lacks the hubris, and he has that grace, and that's what that last sentence is about. That he proves his bona fides by accepting his. He knows he can't escape the U.S. government and the NSA. He worked in the NSA. He knows there's no place he can hide, right? And he takes it on anyway.
Well, but he is hiding. I mean,
Well, he's not. He's hiding in plain sight. He's living in exile,
right.
like Jonah. He's living, and he chooses to live in exile. He says in the film, I don't know if you've seen the film, I'd recommend it, not the Oliver Snowden film, but the Laura Poitras film, Citizen 4, which is an interview of him filmed when he's in the hotel room in Hong Kong while everything is happening. And it's quite interesting, and most of the quotes in the footnotes come from that film. But he says early on, the first thing he tells her is, don't keep my identity confidential. Because if you do, everybody who knows me is going to get blamed, and they're all going to get in trouble. He says, I want you to pin the target on my back so that all my friends will not be caught up in the net, right? And there's a series of things. He says, look, I know they're going to get me. I know this is probably not going to end well for me. He says, I know at very best I'll never see my family again. So he clearly has the understanding that I tried to sketch in this paper.
But he is accepting the protection of a hostile foreign power, and one whose values can't be construed as having been consistent with the position of his dissent. It's not. I mean, there are people who went to the Soviet Union perhaps out of being deluded, but
right. He's not. But I don't think he's one of them. Yeah, I don't think he's deluded about that. I mean, from what I understand, he destroyed his laptop before he went to Russia. So he went there because he really had no option. Although when he went there, he thought he would be able to but what's his name? White-haired dude. WikiLeaks guy, Assange, would get him, that Russia would be a transshipment point. He'd be able to get to Costa Rica. That was the original plan. So he didn't intend to go to Russia. That was just kind of got stuck in Russia.
Yes.
And did he accept Russian protection? Yeah, of course he did. Did he have any other option? I honestly don't think he did. I know. It's pretty clear that wasn't his plan. He was trying to get to Costa Rica through Russia. His passports got revoked, and nobody was supposed to get a Costa Rican passport. That never materialized. So part of the reason for this paper was I had a discussion with my wife after I saw the Snowden film, and the question of whether Snowden is a patriot or whether he's a traitor. So I wrote this paper to argue by indirection that he's a patriot, which is maybe clear if you read the footnotes. I considered whether I should just call the paper Snowden, but that seemed to be a little gauche. Yes?
Oh, okay. So, like you said, there's a lot of people that show dissent. What makes a person who shows dissent memorable, I guess? Or, like, how come you remember Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King, and Socrates, and not, like, somebody else who probably sacrificed also? Is it...
Yeah, there are always many more people who sacrifice and suffer than the ones who become iconic. I think that's right. But so just to I'm not sure if this is a satisfactory answer to your question, but I think that Colin Kaepernick stands out, not because he's the most political of the football players who are protesting and taking a knee, but because he's perfectly okay with paying the price for it.
And the backstory also helps.
Yeah, but all I'm saying is that he's the true dissenter of the sort that I'm talking about. I think that's exactly right. I do like his mother's tweet when Trump, in his speech in Alabama, referred to the football players taking a knee as sons of bitches, and she tweeted back and said, I guess that makes me one proud bitch.
Yeah.
But that's, so I think, those are the things that, that sort of distinguish, it doesn't diminish anybody else's sacrifice.
Yeah.
Right.
She's just taking most of the heat for it, so I guess
People,
that's fine.
right, and but understand that taking the heat is part of what makes the dissent effective, right? It's part of the social communication of the act, which includes taking the heat. That's what I think is, what I find most interesting, sort of the most interesting dynamic. Yeah.
I would certainly think if somebody in the country with, say, the most advanced nuclear weapons above the others would leak that information to the other country, it would even out the score again, and nobody's gonna shoot a bomb, shoot a nuke over
We
the other
can
one
only
first.
hope. I'm not sure I'm any longer confident about it. Yeah, I mean, I hear what you're saying. I think the dangers of proliferation are much greater in that way. But Oppenheimer, after developing the bomb, became a very public dissenter to the use and the maintenance of nuclear power, and he got blackballed for it. He would be another example. Oppenheimer, yes, but Rosenberg's not so much. Yeah.
It occurred to me that, in a way, all of these people, because I'm thinking of you as first of all, as a professor of law, and I'm thinking all these people had violated the law in some context. And then, what does that say about the limits of the law? If someone's dissenting against the law, what role does the law have in being just or fair to the people that, and what is their dissent about if it's not to say that law's got to be changed?
Yeah. Well, it's often, dissent is often about the law, although it's not necessarily the law specific. It could be about some other aspect of society, but that's. Yeah, I don't think a law professor should think that all laws are good. They're not. There are many bad laws. There are many unjust laws. The system has not just injustices, but systematic injustices. I do think that the true dissenter, right, has to be willing to pay the price. I don't think it would work, and I don't think it would happen in any event to say, okay, you're right, we're not going to force the law against you. You walk free. I mean, that only happens in movies. That doesn't happen in real life. That's or TV shows. Right? It happens in weak fiction, but in real life that never happens. But law is not synonymous with what's good and right, and it's a mistake to think so. That's one of Cover's main contributions to legal theory is he's almost an anarchist. Well, that's a little provocative, but he's certainly a pluralist. That is to say, he doesn't think that the law, state law, is the only form of law that there is. He thinks that there are many forms of law, and that human communities of all sorts, he uses religious communities sort of as his paradigm, as his test case, but human communities of all sorts produce their own law. And that people who we would often point to, so that includes obviously dissenters, as acting outside the law or against the law, his argument in that article the principal article that I was citing from Nomos Narrative, is no, it's actually, it's a fight between visions of law, as opposed to between the forces of law and the forces of true anarchy. And that's sort of his main point in that article. And he goes through various examples, including the martyrdom of Rabbi Akiva, but also in particular the Amish as living their own law, and other such insular religious communities as a paradigmatic example. And that's what's the reference to the leftist cadres have their own law and their codes of conduct and how you behave in prison and the barricades. That these are, you may think they're wrong, you might disagree with them, but they're not they're not in fact lawless. The community lives its own law, and they're willing to fight for that law and to sacrifice for that law. So there are struggles over law, over what the law is and what it should be, rather than struggles between law and some antithesis of law. Yes. You had a question earlier?
I think you covered it.
Oh. Go ahead.
Sitting here reminds me of things related. I know my wife has told me a couple times about dissenters in the underground in France when the German occupation was going on. And they decided they were going to, a small group, maybe mostly a political group, decided they were going to assassinate German occupiers whenever they had the chance, and they were warned. They said, you kill one of us and we're killing 100 of you, or just, you know, of citizens. And finally, we talked about it a little bit, and I asked her, and I said, so, who freed France from the Germans? And she said, British and English and Americans, whoever marched in. And as much as I admire the dissenter, I just wonder if they were just too political to make sense, and men, women, and children just, you know, their neighbors were killed as a revenge in return. As much as I admire dissenters, I think you have to look at, you know, the bigger picture of what
Yeah,
happens.
no, that's a fair point. I'm not sure whether I'm willing to judge the resistance in France, or those cells, in the way that your comment implicitly suggests. They might have been wrong to have done what they did, because the cost was so high, but I'm not certain of that. And I don't know how it would look to me if I were in that situation. But one of the things we know about the Germans, right, the Nazis, they did the same thing even if you didn't shoot their officers. Right? I mean, as they retreated throughout Italy, they would literally round up the whole community and put them in the church and just blow up the church. You didn't need an assassination for them to take violent reprisals. So, you know, I mean, I do think there was a moral question there. That's a difficult moral question, but it's not clear to me. It's not that clear to me what the right moral answer to that moral question is. You know, if they had, let's put it this way, we can ask an easier question. If they had sat on their hands and waited for the British and the Americans to come rescue them and done nothing, we would condemn them for that, for the cowardice.
In a simple situation, yeah, this was a complicated situation.
No, I mean,
First
no,
thought-
I actually don't accept that. I don't think you have to see it as a simple situation to reach that conclusion. And the reason I say that is because Maurice Merleau-Ponty, who was a French philosopher, probably the preeminent French philosopher in the 1940s and 50s, even though Sartre became much more famous. But Merleau-Ponty, they were originally friends, and when Merleau-Ponty renounced Marxism, Sartre never spoke to him again. It was Merleau-Ponty who had introduced Sartre to both to Marx and to Hegel. Merleau-Ponty wrote in a piece that was published after the war, he said, there are none of us who survived who are innocent. All of us who survived collaborated in some way. And he was including himself, of course. He said the only people who were genuinely moral are the ones who are no longer with us. And he was there on the ground, and he lost friends. So I take his judgment as probably more likely to be correct than mine. Yes?
Since we have,
Go ahead.
Go ahead. Since we have a little bit of time, maybe I can ask a tangential question.
Ask the
You
hard.
did talk about Colin Kaepernick's kneeling. Are you aware of any credible attempt within the Congress or other places to address the reason for his kneeling? Because in all
No.
this conversation
No, not at all.
between Trump and the media has been complicit in that distraction, because what Colin was doing was to draw attention to the fact that recently, historically,
Right.
as far back as you can go, the law enforcement establishment has been rather savage towards black men. I mean,
The black
and
people.
so on. And what he was doing was not kneeling to say that he disrespects America,
Yeah.
but to draw attention to this phenomenon. And it has gotten caught up in Trump versus the NFL and so on. And I was wondering if there's any law making its way, even among the Democratic lawmakers, to say, well, let's address this in some legal way too. And I think that would
I think there
satisfy
may
a lot
be,
of people.
I think there may be, but I'm not certain of this, one draft bill in Congress, but it's not, no one takes, it's not going anywhere. It's not, it probably has one sponsor and it's just sitting there. Right? So there's no serious, realistic attempt, and none would pass in Republican Congress.
But at least, I mean, if something would show up, I mean, people would feel a little bit more, that some progress has been, because everybody is acknowledging that this is a problem.
Yeah.
But
So
it gets caught up.
I don't
so
mean this to
much.
be as critical as it might sound, but I do think that the NFL players are making a systematic mistake. Not necessarily by kneeling. I think the kneeling is perfectly appropriate. But if the kneeling is controversial, then they need to do one of two things. Find some other somewhat less alienating way to make the same point. But the more important thing they need to do is to organize and to have some more concrete goal on their agenda. So Juliet McClure, who's a sports reporter for the Times, a particularly thoughtful reporter, she was one of the first people to break the Armstrong story when it was not yet cool to pile on. That's Armstrong. She wrote a piece after the first weekend, and she said, what they need to do, in effect, if they're going to kneel, that's fine, but they got to sort of say, we're going to kneel until Trump meets with us, and we can sit down with him in the White House and talk about how we're going to address the underlying problem of police violence against African Americans. That's what and it doesn't have to be kneeling, it could be anything, right? But the symbolic protest is not enough. I mean, I support it, I admire it, I don't think it's enough. But they have to sort of put something on the line. Right? And now that the owners are starting to turn on them.
They've tried a lot of things. There
Yeah.
was the Million Man March, there have been all kinds of things. And so,
But game it out, right? Suppose they all agree that they're going to kneel. Suppose that some substantial subset, and they just kneel, and then the owners react and take them off the field, right? That's going to get attention.
That's where the sacrifice
Yes,
is.
well, that makes a real protest, right? That's
All right.
I told my students this. I said,